Before the long ships arrived, Aotearoa was a world unto itself, a land of deep forests and volcanic peaks ruled by the spirit of the Tangata Whenua, the people of the land. The first encounters were of curiosity and trade, but a shadow was already stretching across the Pacific, a shadow of empire hungry for land and dominion. In 1840, a treaty was signed at Waitangi, a document of two languages and two meanings, a promise of partnership that would soon curdle into an excuse for conquest. The ink was barely dry before the settlers' hunger for land became insatiable, pushing inward, devouring acres with legal fictions and the threat of force. The Māori people, seeing their world shrinking, their mana disregarded, chose a king to unite their tribes, a symbol of resistance against the encroaching tide. The British crown saw not a king, but a rebel, not a union of tribes, but a challenge to its absolute authority that could only be answered with gunpowder. In Taranaki, the dispute over a single block of land became the spark, a disagreement over ownership that the colonial government decided to settle with bayonets. The first shots of the Taranaki War echoed through the valleys, a declaration that the time for words was over and the land would now be paid for in blood. Māori warriors, masters of their terrain, built intricate fortifications called pā, earthwork fortresses with trenches and rifle pits that baffled the British military. The British responded with overwhelming force, bringing artillery to bear, shattering the earth and timber defenses with cannonballs that screamed of industrial death. The war in Taranaki ended not with a treaty, but an uneasy truce, a pause in the bloodshed. The British had been bloodied and stalled, but their resolve to conquer had only hardened. Governor Grey, a man of ruthless ambition, saw the Māori King movement in the Waikato as the true heart of the rebellion, and he began meticulously planning its annihilation. To invade the King's territory, Grey needed a road, a military artery to pump soldiers and supplies into the heartland. He ordered the construction of the Great South Road, a gash carved through the landscape, pushing ever closer to the Māori frontier. Every mile of road built was a declaration of intent, a slow, methodical tightening of the noose. On July 12, 1863, the ultimatum expired. General Duncan Cameron led his troops across the Mangatahiri stream, the boundary line of the Kingitanga lands. This was no mere border skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion, an act of total war. The crossing was a point of no return, a promise that the Waikato would be drowned in fire and blood. The British brought a new weapon to the fight, armored, shallow-draft gunboats. These floating fortresses, bristling with cannons, steamed up the Waikato River, bypassing Māori defenses and striking deep into their territory. The river, once a source of life for the Waikato tribes, had been turned into a highway for their destroyers. The initial Māori strategy was one of guerrilla warfare, ambushing supply lines and harassing the advancing columns from the dense bush. Warriors would strike like ghosts from the trees, unleashing a volley of fire before melting back into the shadows. For the British soldiers, the forest became a place of terror, where every rustle of leaves could mean a sudden, violent death. The British advance was slow and costly, marked by brutal, close-quarters fighting in the bush. The Forest Rangers, a colonial unit of hardened bushmen, were formed to counter the Māori tactics. They fought fire with fire, adopting the enemy's methods of stealth and ambush, becoming just as ruthless and feared as the warriors they hunted. The next great stand was at Rangiriri. Here, the Kingitanga had constructed one of the most sophisticated defensive systems of the entire war, a massive complex of trenches, rifle pits, and redoubts stretching from the river to a swamp. They were determined to make the British pay for every inch of ground. On November 20th, 1863, General Cameron launched his assault on Rangiriri. The British artillery pounded the earthworks, but the defenders, deep in their trenches, held firm. The initial infantry assaults were thrown back with horrific casualties, the attackers cut down in droves by withering fire from the rifle pits. As the battle raged, a group of British soldiers, in a moment of confusion, managed to enter the central redoubt through an undefended section. The Maori defenders, now trapped and surrounded, fought on through the night. The darkness was filled with the screams of the wounded and the crack of sporadic gunfire. The next morning, a white flag was raised. The Maori defenders, low on ammunition and having suffered heavy losses, believed they were negotiating a truce or honorable surrender terms as per their custom. But the British saw it as an unconditional surrender, a concept alien to Maori warfare. The betrayal was swift and absolute. 183 warriors who had laid down their arms were taken as prisoners of war, a deep dishonor. They were stripped of their dignity and marched away, their hopes of a negotiated peace shattered. The fall of Rangiriri was a devastating blow to the Kingitanga, both militarily and spiritually. The Maori forces, led by the brilliant strategist Rui Maniapoto, fell back to a new defensive line. They prepared for a final, decisive battle, choosing a site near a small peach grove. The pa they built there was called Orakau. It would become the site of their most legendary and tragic last stand. The pa at Orakau was hastily constructed and critically flawed. Crucially, it had no internal water source, a fatal oversight. The defenders numbered only around 300, and this small force included women and children who had refused to leave their families. They were about to face nearly 2,000 professional soldiers. On March 30th, 1864, the British forces discovered and surrounded Orakau. They immediately began a siege, digging trenches and establishing artillery positions. A storm of lead and iron rained down on the pa, relentlessly pounding the defenders huddled in their shallow rifle pits. For 3 days, the small garrison held out against impossible odds. They fought with a courage that astonished the British. When their ammunition for muskets ran low, they fired peach stones and pieces of wood. Thirst became an agonizing torment, their tongues swelling in their mouths under the hot sun. The reply came, clear and defiant. "I hoa ka wohai tonu matu, ache, ache, ache. Friend, we will fight on forever and ever and ever." And when asked about the women and children, the call came back that they too would die with their men. This was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of total resistance, even in the face of certain death. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The British and their colonial allies, the forest rangers, hunted the fleeing Maori through the swamp. There was no quarter given. Wounded warriors were bayoneted where they lay. Women were shot down alongside the men. The chase was a bloody, merciless affair. Over 150 of the defenders of Orakau were killed during the siege and the breakout. It was a crushing military defeat for the Kingitanga, but a moral victory that became a cornerstone of Maori identity. Their stand became a symbol of ultimate resistance, a willingness to sacrifice everything for honor and freedom. With the Waikato conquered, the colonial government enacted its final revenge. The New Zealand Settlements Act was passed, a legal tool for mass land confiscation, or raupatu. Millions of acres of the most fertile Maori land were seized as punishment for rebellion, leaving the Waikato tribes impoverished and landless. The war now splintered into new, even more brutal phases. In Taranaki, the prophet Te Uahomin founded the Pai Marae religion, a syncretic faith that blended Christian and Maori beliefs. Its followers, known as Hauhau, were driven by a spiritual fervor that made them formidable and feared warriors. Believing divine protection made them immune to bullets. The conflict became a grim hunt. Bounties were placed on the heads of resistance leaders. Men like Te Kuti Arakarangi Te Tiruki, a brilliant but wronged leader, were pursued relentlessly through the wilderness. Te Kuti, unjustly exiled, had escaped his island prison and returned to wage a brilliant and bloody guerrilla war against the government. By the early 1870s, the major fighting was over. The Maori had been overwhelmed by sheer numbers, superior firepower, and the devastating loss of their land and resources. The final phase was not one of treaties, but of punishment. Special courts were established to try those deemed rebels with predictable and deadly outcomes. Mass executions became a tool of state terror. Men who had fought for their land and sovereignty were now branded traitors and murderers. Gallows were erected, and public hangings were carried out to break the will of any remaining resistance. These were not acts of justice, but brutal displays of colonial power.